Chapter 5. When she'd lit the beacon, Prudence made her way to the cottage. The two automatons had stationed themselves against the wall on either side of the head of the bed, their mechanical gazes turning toward her as she entered. Since they could not show emotion, their blank gazes gave no indication of what their next moves would be. How badly is he injured? Automatons liked questions, if they could like anything. He hit his cranium, one of them said. He has been unconscious since the attack, the other added. Attack? She preferred to think of it as a rescue. Interesting that while they looked identical, the automatons' voices had been programmed to sound different. Do you have designations? I am Fred. I am Winston. Names, not numbers. This was another divergence from the other Ernests. This Ernest had fled his grief and mostly eschewed human contact, but had given his automatons names. In all the other dimensions, he was at home in Galveston with his wife. All of those Ernests and Ophelias had survived the storm of 1900. Only in this dimension was it the great storm of 1900, resulting in a devastating loss of life, including that of his fiancée and her father. The loss of his Ophelia had spawned more differences in Ernest's observable life, but so far these had not resulted in the formation of new dimensions. This went against known dimensional science. And in an interesting dichotomy there was the storm, which had appeared across all dimensions, though not in the same places in each, which was again not typical of what was known, or believed to be known to a science even more imprecise than she'd realized. This was the first dimension where the storm had appeared in the Gulf. And it was only in this dimension that Ernest had left Galveston. If the storm wanted an Ernest, it could have easily found one of the predictable Ernests. Instead, it appeared to want this one. He'd traveled the world for the last 4 years. The storm had also cruised around. Had their paths crossed at some point? Or not crossed but intersected? Was there a connection between this aberrant Ernest and the storm? If that was the storm heading toward them, it could just be a storm. That was the question she'd been sent to answer. The hope being that in the answer lay the way to stop the storm. Because it didn't just appear in all dimensions. The storm seemed to be drawing energy from the other dimensions, degrading and destabilizing them, eating at the edges like acid. What was different about this dimension? Or was she looking at that difference? Or was the difference something he'd learned in his travels? She took a deep breath and looked at the automatons. With the storm coming, I'm sure Dr. Warren would like his gear and instruments, all his research material secured from the airship. She gave them time to process this information, then added, the safest structure in the storm is probably the lighthouse. Stow it in the area below the lamp. That will be the safest place. Prudence wasn't sure about up being safe if it was the storm. It might put them up in the very heart of it. But she hadn't been sent here to do the safe thing. And the lighthouse walls were some thick. That should help. Because she hadn't been sent to die either. She looked at the one called Fred. Perhaps you could stay with the doctor, and Winston could secure the ship and the doctor's things? I'm sure his ship handlers would help. She'd pitched her tone to be authoritative, but hopefully not too much. Bodyguard automatons were tricky. After a processing pause, Winston nodded and left the room. Prudence waited until he'd thumped out of the cottage and then said, I'll get some water for his injury. Ernest woke with an aching head and a significant gap in his memory. He'd been on the weatherman, and now he wasn't. How had that happened? He kept his lashes down and studied the woman from under them, not ready to confess he was awake until he felt more certain what he was waking to. So far there was just the woman, but that did not help with his unease. He avoided women. Women reminded him of what he had lost. Or worse, tried to console him. Tried to fill the empty place. It was best just avoid them as much as possible. Only this time he couldn't get away, couldn't avoid. There was something about this one that bothered him more than usual. She was attractive, he acknowledged with extreme reluctance, felt an immediate stab of guilt at this disloyalty. His friends told him he shouldn't mourn forever, but he'd lived while she died. It should have been the other way around. She'd been so bright, so full of life, that he couldn't believe she'd agreed to marry him, a dry, dull inventor, over all the other more interesting suitors who'd vied for her hand. But she had. He'd sensed the signs of a possibly dangerous storm, despite the lack of concern by those who should have known. He'd shared his concerns, had asked her to leave with him. She had listened to her father and the other experts. He tried to find her in it, but the storm won. It beat him back. Kept him from doing his duty. She and her father had died. All he could do for her now was remain loyal. Never forget. He wouldn't have noticed this woman if he'd not been at such a disadvantage, he insisted to himself. Any man, alone in a bedroom with a strange woman, would be unsettled and feel caught off guard. She looked at him like she knew he watched her. There was both sympathy and humor and something else in her eyes. In an effort at regaining control, he lifted his lashes, trying for dispassionate distance, to see her as a scientist might. What was she doing here? He looked around. Where was here? The room was Spartan, spare. Some effort had been made to personalize it. A few photos. Some of those things women made for the tops of dressers. They were close to the sea, based on the humidity in the air and the faint smell of the ocean. Because he could not help it, his gaze wandered back to her. Brown eyes and hair, no way to assess her height while she sat. She was dressed for travel. Her corset was leather and durable, her boots sturdy and sensible. She'd left off her hat, but goggles hung about her neck. Her sleeves below the elbow sported intricate brass and leatherwork, the panels running down the top of her arms. An odd conceit, in an otherwise practical ensemble. Why did he sense impatience, restlessness when she sat with outward stillness, her hands folded, unmoving? A slight tilt to her head presented a jawline that was clean in its lines, with a hint of stubbornness. There was intelligence in her eyes, and humor softened the line of her mouth. His gaze lingered on her mouth until it curved up. He jerked, his hands clenching on the coarse blanket. A gentleman did not? Does your head hurt very badly? Her voice was clear and cool, like the mountain streams after a storm. He pulled himself into a semi-sitting position, for the first time becoming aware of Henry to one side. The automaton moved to assist him to sit, tucking the pillow behind his back before retreating again. Pieces of memory began to return, as if sitting up had shaken them loose in his head. The storm. There'd been a strange storm. Had he dreamt that? He must have, because there'd also been a giant octopus. I'm sorry that Octavius startled you. He's young, and he got a bit excited, a little over-enthusiastic. He's still learning to manage all those arms. She shrugged and moved her arms like tentacles. I didn't dream it. He didn't know whether to be relieved, or angry, or something in between. Her elegant brows rose. No. Octavius is quite real, though not at all malicious. He was the best available option for getting you clear of the storm, you see, or I wouldn't have risked his life. The storm. The specters in the storm. Had he really seen Ophelia just before? I promised Dr. Masterson that I'd try to help make sure you made it safely ashore. Her mouth curved up a bit, ironically. I should be more careful what I promise. Perhaps he had not yet waked from his strange dream. Light filtered down from above, as well from a lantern. He could smell coffee and food of some kind. If this was a dream, it was most vivid. Where am I? This is the sand island off Mobile Bay, and we're in the lightkeeper's cottage. He processed this for a few seconds. Then he frowned. How long was I unconscious? She consulted a watch extracted from a pocket on her leather corset vest. Gave it a slight shake and restored it to its pocket. I did not note the time, but you've been out an hour since you arrived here. His frown deepened. But I was some distance from making landfall. He no longer felt sure of his calculations. He looked at his automaton. Before he could ask, she spoke again. Octavius is a very fast swimmer. Octopuses are, you know. They can't swim fast for long periods, but he didn't like the storm. Something in her eyes changed. She shifted in her chair. What was it like? He did not want to talk about that. And he felt acutely the disadvantage of being prone, even if she was seated. None of it made sense. More than he needed for his head to stop aching, he needed to reach a place where something made sense. Anything. He shifted his legs to the edge and lowered them to the wooden floor. It helped to get them on something solid, though his head swam unpleasantly. He rubbed his face. It did not help, so he looked at her again. I do not wish to be rude, but who are you? Her eyes widened. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot you haven't met me. Why did her words seem to imply she'd met him? He blinked. That was not possible. And yet, there was something familiar about her. I'm Prudence Pinkerton. He'd heard the name Pinkerton, heard of the detective agency, but she was a woman, a female. And if she were a detective, what would she detect here? Not that she'd claimed to be one. She'd asked about the storm, but a storm would not be of interest to a detective agency. Vaguely he knew the Pinkertons dealt with crimes, such as train robberies and the like, or so he'd heard. Why would Masterson have dealings with them? Or have sent this woman to help him make it ashore? Masterson could not have known about the storm. He felt slow and stupid, feelings he did not like. Men were not slow and stupid in the presence of women. They were. He slammed his thoughts down. He was through with women. Masterson knew this, and still he'd sent this one. A woman with a giant octopus. Did Masterson know about that? He cast her a look of suspicion. Her lips twitched as if she read his thoughts. Ophelia used to call him a closed book, but this one appeared to read him easily enough. I could tell you how I came to have Octavius, but it wouldn't help. She seemed oddly comfortable with being alone with him. She appeared respectable, but there was also something not that she looked like a loose woman, it wasn't that. He studied her. Her ease was more of that between two men, as if they were equal. Was she a suffragette? He avoided those as well. Where had they met? You are, he paused, adjusting his assessment to something more polite, most unusual. She grinned. Yes, I am. Her head tilted to one side, as she gave him an equally direct survey. So are you, Dr. Warren. She paused, then added, I've never met anyone being stalked by a storm. He stiffened. It is most atypical, but, he stopped when her brows rose over an abruptly ironic gaze. His mouth set in a stubborn line. Storms do not stalk people. While it may appear to have been on the same course, there will be a logical explanation for it. She rested an elbow on the arm of the rocker, then rested her chin in the palm of her hand. And what is that logical explanation, Dr. Warren? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Finally muttered, if it is following me, which I doubt very much. It changed course after Octavius collected you. It's following a straight line that will bring it to this location by morning if it maintains its current speed. Sooner if it speeds up. He blinked, trying to figure out which part of this was the most unbelievable. How could you know its current speed or course? Did your octopus tell you? She looked amused. No, Octavius does many useful things, but that isn't one of them. She hesitated. I could tell you how I know, but you'd have to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Can you do that, Doctor? You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.